button on Facebook, and then I'll start admitting people. Okay.
Rahul?
Yes, sir.
I think somebody's fan is making noise somewhere. Some creaking noise is coming, a little bit of creaking noise is coming from somewhere. Anyway.
Yes, we are live on Facebook now. So. Purnima?
Yes. Just give me a signal, I'll start.
Yeah, let's start.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the 9th webinar on Enriching ELT in Liberal Arts Educational Framework, a gateway to open pursuit of knowledge. Let me extend my warm welcome to our guest speakers, Theron Muller and Colin Skeets from Japan. I would also like to welcome our source of inspiration, the president of ELT Pune chapter, Dr. Zerin Patil, all our ELT Pune chapter members, participants, and dear office bearers. I hope you all are enjoying the series of webinars on the teaching of English beyond borders. If you have missed any, I would like to request you to go and watch them on our official Facebook page. Don't forget to like our page to never ever miss our programs in the future. This webinar is being organized by ELT Pune chapter and powered by Tolani Maritime Institute, Pune. Tolani Maritime Institute, located at Taregaon Chakhand Road, is one of the leading institutes in South Asia offering training in maritime studies. They offer programs like BTech in Marine Engineering, BSc in Nautical Science, Diploma in Nautical Science, and many other certificate courses. I'm happy to share with all of you that for this webinar, we have over 300 registrations from Oman, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Nepal, Iran, Iraq, UK, and Pakistan. From India, we have registrations from 22 states and 5 union territories. Before I request Mr. Rahul Kale, Executive Secretary, to introduce ELT Pune chapter, I would like to inform you that the feedback link of this webinar will be shared during the question and answer session. You're requested to write your names correctly. Please do not write it in full block. You're also requested to write your questions in the Q&A section, which you can see on your screen. If you're watching us on Facebook, don't forget to post questions in the comment box. Thank you. May I now request Rahul to introduce ELT Pune chapter. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Purnima. I hope I'm loud and clear.
Yes.
Distinguished guests and audience from India and abroad. Wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much for taking out your precious time on this Sunday afternoon. On behalf of the ELT Pune chapter, I'd like to welcome all of you for this 9th webinar on the teaching of English beyond borders. It is my proud privilege to introduce Pune chapter of the English Language Teachers Association of India, ELT. As you all know, ELT was founded by the noted educationist, late Padma Shri S. Natarajan. ELT has been bringing teachers of English in India and abroad together through national and international level academic activities. It is the largest language association of teachers of English in India with nearly 5,000 members. It is an associate of the International Association of Teachers of English as foreign language UK and the teachers of English to speakers of other languages. ELT completed 50 years in October 2019, and what a great fortune. In the same year, ELT Pune chapter was inaugurated under the leadership of Professor Z.N. Patil. It was humble beginning with just a few teachers in the beginning, but then now it is one of the fastest growing chapters in the country, reaching 200 members. To be precise, we have 196 members, and I'm sure by today evening we'll be completing 200 members mark. Professor Sridhar Gokhale and Professor Prashant Sinha are the patrons of the chapter, and the chapter has proved to be one of the youthful and the vibrant chapters under the far-sighted and incredible leadership of the president of the chapter, Professor Z.N. Patil. Professor Patil, who is constantly holding the chapter to great heights, and we are very thankful to him. I'd like to underline that all the office bearers and the members of ELT Pune chapter have been uplifting the values of the teaching profession through various academic activities. And this is the stunning attribute of the Pune chapter. Since its inception, the chapter has been conducting workshops and training programs for teachers and students in collaboration with many institutes like English Language Teaching Institute of Symbiosis, College of Engineering Pune, Tolani Maritime Institute, to name a few. And it is living up to its motto, reaching the unreached. During this challenging time of pandemic too, the chapter has conducted several activities, workshops online in collaboration with the entire Maharashtra English Language Teachers Association, that is called EMELTA, Mumbai English Educators Team, MEET, and the English Language Teaching Institute of Symbiosis. The office bearers of Pune chapter have been invited by various national and international organizations to conduct sessions online. I extend my best wishes to both the speakers and the audience. Have a great day ahead. Thank you. Over to you, Purnima.
Thank you, Rahul. I would now like to request Mr. Kiran Patil, one of our office bearers, to introduce our guest speakers for today. Over to you, Kiran.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Purnima. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiran Patil. I am one of the office bearers of the ELT Pune chapter. Let me at the very beginning extend my warm welcome to our guest speakers, Theron Muller and Colleen Skeets, who are here to share their insights with us on a very interesting topic. The topic for today's webinar is small-scale classroom investigations and how experimenting with your teaching can lead to big improvements in learning. Theron and Colleen, it is my privilege to introduce you both. Theron Muller is an associate professor at the University of Toyama, Japan. He has been active in promoting teacher research since 2005. His PhD with Open University UK investigated the writing for publication experiences of Japan-based language teacher authors. He regularly presents at international conferences on topics related to English as a foreign language education. His research has been published in international journals such as Writing and Pedagogy and the Asian EFL Journal. He is the lead editor on 2 book projects, Innovating EFL Teaching in Asia, 2012, and Exploring EFL Fluency in Asia, 2014, both with Palgrave Macmillan. Now, Colleen Skeets has taught English for over 25 years in 3 different countries, and he has taught his students as young as 4 years and as old as 90-year-old. Though he is currently a coordinator for a university intensive English program, he has in the past been an assistant teacher, teacher trainer, and a part-time university lecturer. This is his first time interacting with India. Theron and Colleen, I welcome you again. Over to you, Purnima.
Thank you, Kiran. May I now request our guest speakers to deliver their talk? Over to you, Theron and Colin.
All right, thank you very much, Purnima, and thank you very much, Kiran, for the introduction. Let me try to share my screen here. There we go. So, Colin and I wanted to start out our presentation by sharing just a little bit about us, because we don't know that many of the participants are familiar with Japan and where we live. So very quickly, the top picture is a picture taken in Toyama, which is where I live. You can see the Tateyama mountain range in the background. One of the features of Toyama City is that you can stand on the coast by the ocean on the beach, and you can see the mountains in the background, although Toyama is famous for its rainy weather. So it's only about 12 days a year that you can actually do that. But when the days are clear, it is a really spectacular sight. In the map of Japan on the left, Toyama is the blue dot that is toward the west and toward the north near the Sea of Japan. So Toyama Bay is a bay that is connected to the Sea of Japan. Over to you, Colin.
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity to present to all of you. Where I am currently in Yokohama, Japan, which is the other little blue dot, which says basically Tokyo. Yokohama is actually just south of Tokyo. I've lived here for over 20 years. And the picture that we've selected for you is sort of like the picturesque kind of view of Yokohama. It doesn't always look like this, and it actually can vary greatly. This is more the city kind of size of Yokohama. It's about half the size of Pune, so about a population of about 3.9 million. Darren.
Okay. So we're going to start by answering this question for ourselves, and then hopefully after we've answered this question for ourselves, we'll have an opportunity for some of the attendees to answer this question for themselves, to talk about who you're teaching and what teaching contexts you've taught in and you teach in. This is a chance for us to get to know our audience a little bit, and it's a chance for you to get to know us, but it also has a practical purpose, because what we want to do in today's presentation is to have you think about some practical ways to do some small scale investigations in your teaching. And one of the things I found as I've worked with students over the years on some of the master's programs I've worked on is that when you're trying to think about how to improve your teaching, it's very important not to have a kind of general context in mind, but it's much more important to have a very specific context in mind. So instead of saying, for example, I'm interested in doing research with elementary school students, it's much more effective to say, I'm teaching this class of elementary school students in the coming semester, and I want to help them to improve their reading skills. So being more specific can help to make what you're going to do for your classroom research much more practical and much more actionable. So first about me, at the University of Toyama, I mainly teach first-year Japanese university students. I've been here since 2011, but I've been living in Japan since 2000. And so before I started working at the University of Toyama, I had my own private English language school where I taught English to students of all ages. And I've also taught at a Japanese national high school and at junior colleges. Colin?
As for myself, I teach at the university level. I'm a coordinator, but I also teach 6 or 7 or so classes per semester. I teach mainly first and second year students. The skills I focus on are listening and speaking, with an emphasis on trying to develop some sort of fluency. So listening fluency or speaking fluency. In the past, I've taught, as I said in the introduction, I've taught learners as young as 4 and as old as 90. And I've taught, besides Japan, I've also taught English in Canada. And for 2 years, I taught in Thailand. There.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I'm hoping this will work. I'd like to pass the question over to some of our audience members and have you answer this question. Who do you teach and what is your teaching context? Rahul, can you make some
Right,
of the...
right, Theron. I will just request
okay.
our audiences to kindly type their answers in the chat box so that we can redirect it to our speakers.
Or our panel members can unmute themselves and speak on this.
Right. Till we get some responses, maybe I could start, and I guess Rahul and Kiran could pitch in. Well, I teach English to prospective lawyers in a law college.
Oh,
So it is ESP.
okay. My intensive program is in the law faculty as well.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I'd be interested in talking to you afterwards. That's
Same here, Colin.
Well, I'll also mention that I teach technical writing as well as communication skills to maritime students. I mean, Marine Engineering College. That's Tulani Maritime Institute. And it's 4th year right now and the 1st year. ESP, under English for Specific Purposes in Maritime English.
Okay.
It says here that the chat box is disabled, that in order to put into the chat box, you need to enable it.
Right.
Put in the
Right.
Q&A.
I think this is...
Rahul, I
seminar.
see some participants raising their hands. Can we allow them to unmute themselves? Like I see Sarita, Meena raising their hands.
Sarita can speak now.
Okay. Sarita, could you please unmute yourself? Meena, could you please unmute yourself?
Hello?
Yes, Meena, you are audible.
Yeah, so very good afternoon to the panelists and to everybody. I teach in Vasavi College of Engineering. I teach communication skills and a little bit of technical communication. The chat box is actually disabled, so could you please do something about it?
Yeah, we are working on it. Yes, over to you, Hemlata.
I teach English, communication English to Ajim Premji Foundation staff. I'm working for Ajim Premji University.
Okay,
Well-
and then we have a couple people who have mentioned that they teach English to engineering students, and then we have middle school, higher secondary students, some primary classes, and postgraduate students are some other comments. I think that gives us enough information to continue with the presentation. Would you agree with that, Colin?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much for
Okay.
everyone for putting their answers in the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have one more question coming, which is, what are some examples of classroom activities that you want to investigate and improve?
Again, I would request the audience, the participants, to start typing in the chat box.
Yeah, one person asked to focus on blended learning strategies. So it sounds like one person is interested in blended learning strategies in the classroom. And if you could type your answers in the chat box, it looks like the chat box is working now. So what are some examples of classroom activities that you want to investigate and improve? That's the question.
Online techniques to teach English, collaborative learning, flipped classrooms. Looks like we got some interesting things here. Mind game activities. How to provide easy listening practice. Using Chinese whisper to teach vocabulary. Some interesting ideas here.
Writing skills, okay.
Lecture method, okay. How to handle distance learning in the crisis time, or a limited source of connection. I think all of us can relate to that. Task-based. Task-based in language learning and teaching. Many students do not like to read the text rather than just read summary and prepare them for exam. Would love to do some investigation on it. Examples to enhance speaking skills. We'll be talking a little bit about that today. Concentration.
Report writing, okay.
These are great answers, guys. Making online teaching effective and interesting. How can we make our learners independent learners through technology? Ooh, that's a very interesting topic. Multicultural or multilingual classrooms?
Grammar in a large classroom.
That's fun.
Spelling, autonomy. Okay, these are all excellent ideas. So do you think we've got enough ideas to keep going here, Colin?
I do. I think we can take it from here. Thank you, everybody, for your ideas. These are great. Hopefully, Karen and I will be able to give you some ideas as to how you can do that. We're going to try to provide a framework. Darren, over to you.
Okay, and then as I was saying earlier, in my experience, it always helps to have a specific group of students, a specific context, and also a specific activity or a specific idea in mind for what you want to try to investigate and improve, which is why we were asking these questions to try to get these seeds planted in your mind so that as we go through our presentation, you can think yourself about how you could try to investigate those different ideas that you shared in the chat. So the first thing we wanted to do was to talk about Kolb's learning cycle and the cycle of teacher reflection. I'm going to let you introduce this, Colin.
Yeah, this is actually very old research. This is from the 1980s, but it's from Kolb's learning cycle. There's actually a whole branch of learning theory called experiential learning. And it's just a couple of cycles, a couple of stages that are kind of useful when you're thinking about doing a small scale investigation. The first stage starts with plan or prepare. And in this stage, you think about what is the activity, who's doing the activity, basically what teachers do every day. And then in the classroom, you actually do the activity, where your students do the activities and you, the teacher, have to sort of think about what do you do in this? Do you help the students? What's your role in the classroom? The third stage is observe. You need to have some way of observing the activity, some kind of, it doesn't necessarily have to be objective, but some kind of mechanism by which you can see what is happening. And then the last stage is reflecting on the activity. Did it do what you wanted it to do? Should you do it again? How should you modify it to make it better? Darren?
So one of the points that we want to make in our presentation is that this is not completely different from what teachers do every day. So typically teachers who are getting ready to teach an activity are already doing the planning and preparing, and they're also doing the activity, experiencing the activity in their classroom. However, what tends to happen is that, particularly because teachers are so busy, we have such hectic schedules, we have so many classes we need to cover, the observation and the reflection tends to not be part of teachers' everyday planning. So the planning is mainly concentrated on what am I going to do in the classroom? How am I going to teach this with my students? But there isn't a space for many teachers in their lives to observe their own teaching, think about their own teaching, reflect on their own teaching, and then try to use those reflections to improve their own practice. So the point that Colin and I wanted to make in today's presentation is that this idea of observing your own practice and trying to improve your own practice is largely compatible with what teachers are already doing. It's just a matter of thinking about how to expand on it to a certain extent. Colin, did you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so our focus here today is, though we're not going to, all four stages are, of course, very useful, are very important to think about. What we want to focus on today is to sort of get you thinking about the observe part and the reflect and evaluate part. We want to give you a way in which this can be done. And more precisely, we want to kind of narrow it down. It's small scale. Now, Theron's going to talk about this in a little bit, but the objective here today is something small. Don't go big. Just start with something small, especially if this is your first time to do any kind of investigation. Start with something small and manageable. Darren?
Okay, so when we were preparing this presentation, we had the plan to ask participants to think about different activities they would want to investigate. And we also answered that same question for ourselves, thinking about what classroom activities would we be interested in investigating. So one of the activities that I've thought about investigating in the past that I do regularly with my students is a free speaking activity. It's loosely based off of what Paul Nation refers to as a 4-3-2 activity. So the original idea was have students talk about something for 4 minutes, then 3 minutes, and then 2 minutes. But in my experience teaching first-year students in Japan, if I give students 4 minutes to talk, they might talk for 30 seconds or maybe a minute, and then there's going to be 3 minutes of awkward silence. So I tried to adapt that activity to fit better with the students that I have, the students that I teach. So I give them a topic and I ask them to talk for a minute, which is kind of the planning and then the doing, and then thinking about how to observe their performance. One idea would be to track the number of words they speak. So for example, in my lessons, in a semester, I have 15 90-minute lessons. And so over the course of those 15 lessons, each week, I could have the students do this activity. And then the observation could be tracking the number of words the students speak. One way to do that would be for the students to use their cell phones to record themselves and then to listen to the recording and count how many words they spoke. Another way to do that could be to assign partners to students so that there's groups of two, and in the groups of two, while one partner is talking, the other partner is counting how many words they spoke. And then the reflection for this activity could be me as the teacher seeing if the number of words spoken changed over the course of the semester. And there could also be a reflection for the students. The students could see for themselves if how many words they spoke changed over the course of the semester, if their speaking speed increased. Colin?
All right. So Theron has talked about an activity called free speaking. I'm going to talk about another activity called talk, walk, and write. Now, one thing that you'll notice as we talk about these activities, we are actually thinking about the context in which these activities are done in. They will be needed to be changed if you decide to do the same activity. These are only for example only. We're not stating that all teachers should do this activity, either one. So for my activity, it's basically you get students into groups of three, and the first student is the reader. They read text that the teacher has prepared, maybe sentences from the textbook. Person number two, this person listens to the reader, has to remember what has been said, and then walk, or most students will run, and they have to tell what they have heard to the writer, who is person number three, student number three. The writer is on the other side of the room. How do you check? How do you observe what has gone on? Well, the students in groups of three afterwards can compare. They can look at the sentences that the reader had with what the writer has written down. Maybe highlight which words they are missing. Here you could look at things like prepositions or articles or nouns, whatever your target grammar is. For this activity, instead of focusing on fluency per se, we're more interested in focusing on accuracy. Darren?
Okay, and I think Colin raises an excellent question there. Raises an excellent point there. We have chosen these as kind of example activities, and we would encourage you to think about what's more important for you. For example, in the free speaking activity with my students, I tend to be more interested in trying to get them to say more because their production tends to be quite low. So if they take, for example, the TOEFL test, they have trouble producing the number of words that are expected when they do the spoken parts of the test. So their production, the number of words they say is quite low. So I tend to work on fluency. I tend to try to get them to say more. But in your classroom, if you're working with, for example, postgraduate students, maybe they can produce enough words, but you're more worried about the quality of their production. And if that's the case, then you could certainly change what you're observing from the number of words to, say, mistakes that they make, or to examining the structure to see if they're making sense when they present the information. So now we're going to return to Kolb's learning cycle, and we're going to talk about the different steps in that learning cycle. So for the free speaking, in the planning and preparing, there's the choice of topics to be made. In the past, I've given students the opportunity to suggest topics, and I've used topics from them. Now I've been teaching where I'm at for about 9 years, so I feel like I have a good idea of what topics the students are interested in. So I tend to decide those now before the semester begins. I tend to prepare a short example. So every time I give my students a prompt to respond to, I answer that prompt myself so that I'm modeling what I'm expecting the students to do. And then in the planning and preparing phase, you want to make a decision about how to track students' performances, or you want to ask the question, what are you going to be observing? So like I said before, I'm particularly interested in evaluating, tracking students' fluency, how many words they say, but in your context, you may be interested in trying to evaluate some other aspect of student performance. Colin?
Yeah, so in talk, walk, and write, here the planning, what's done before the actual activity, the teacher may create some strips of paper, or you could just identify parts of the textbook that you want the reader to read out. You need to decide the groups of the students. Another thing, depending on your level of students, if you're worried whether or not they can understand what needs to be done, you can get all the speakers together, all the runners together, and all the writers together, and then have them talk to each other. Make sure they understand their role. Again, this will be context dependent. So these are some of the ideas that you need to think about before you're going to do the actual activity. Darren?
Okay. So returning to the free speaking, in the do and the experience stage, like I said, I try to model the language for the students so that they have an idea of what's expected of them for each of the topics they're expected to speak about. With my students in the past, I've tried to give them the speaking activity or the speaking topic, and then I've told them, please talk. That's the way the TOEFL test is structured. Typically in the TOEFL test, you'll get the topic that you're supposed to talk about, and then very quickly, within 15 seconds, you're supposed to start talking. But my students have given me feedback in the past saying that having a very short period of time to prepare is too difficult, and so they've had trouble performing. So one thing I do with my students now is I'll give them a minute or 2 minutes to take short notes, to think about what they want to say about that topic. Then after that, they can do the activity. They can speak with their partner with their notes. I'll ask the students' partners to ask some questions about what the students has said. And then typically in my classroom, I will change the partners around, and then I will have the students do the activity a second time with a new partner, this time not looking at their notes. So either I'll collect the notes so they don't have them, or I'll ask them to close their notebooks so they don't see them, and then they can try to do the performance again without having a paper in front of them to prompt them about what to say. Colin?
All right. So during the do and experience part, both the students and the teachers are active. For the students, each has a role. The reader is reading the short text. The listener is listening, memorizing, and writing. And the writer is at the other end, writing what they're being told. For the teacher, here is where you can really start to do a little investigating. Usually during these periods, when an activity is going on, I used to just sort of clue out and just sort of relax. But if you're doing a small scale investigation, this is where you can become a little more active, a little more focused. As a teacher, this is where you can actually do the observing part. You can write down things that you're noticing. Just short little notes to yourself to try to help you remember how the activity is going. What are things that you notice? I'll talk more about this in the next slide. Darren?
Okay, so now we're on to the observe stage from the 4-part cycle. Here with the free speaking activity, my suggestion has been to track how many words the students speak. One way to do that would be for the students to record themselves. Almost all of my students have smartphones now. So almost all smartphones come with some recording software. So I can ask them to use that recording software to record themselves, and then they can listen to it and transcribe. I'm sorry, I have fire engines in the background. I'll try not to let that distract me though. They can listen to that, and then they can try to transcribe what they've written. I'm sorry, transcribe what they've said, and then they can even think about how to correct their own language, how to improve their own language looking at the transcription. Another option is if you don't have the ability for students to record themselves, you could have their partner count the number of words that they say, or you could have their partner count how many times they have a long pause of more than a second or 2 seconds where they're not saying anything. And then you could do an analysis of the errors that students made. And you could also look at, say, what vocabulary problems there are in the student's speech that as a teacher you could then later address. Colin?
Okay, so one of the things that Darren did there was he said words like do an analysis. So here, what we're gonna mention this a little bit later, but please note, each of these 4 stages are not separate. They actually overlap. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind. As you're trying to do this in the classroom, remember that there is some overlapping, and that's natural. So during the observation stage of talk, walk, and write, here I'm busy as a teacher. So if I can get my students to do some of the work, that's a good thing. And I highly recommend you do the same. So here you want to have the students writing down numbers, you know, how many errors did they make? How many words did they get right? As teachers, we tend to focus on what they got wrong. How about focusing on what they got right? There's another idea. Encouraging your students, trying to motivate them. Hey, you got 5 right this time. Next week, let's go for 6. Make English a little more interesting and fun. As for the teacher, things that you can write down, what issues did you notice in your little notebook to yourself? Also, how did students do? How did they react to the activity? What were things that went well, and how would you want to change it? Either the structure of the activity or what students were actually doing. The interesting part, though, comes in the last slide. There.
Okay, so this is a practical example from my own classroom of that kind of observation stage. So as I mentioned before, I teach about 15 90-minute classes in a semester. So you'll see down toward the bottom, it says class, and then there's 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 13. So because of breaks for the winter and such, I don't necessarily do this activity for all 15 classes of the semester. But in this example, I've got it across for 13 of the 15 classes. And then you'll see at the very bottom, there's a topic that we did each week. And that handwriting is not my handwriting. That's a student's handwriting. And then there's a chart and there's different numbers that are written in. This activity was actually not a free speaking activity. This was a writing activity, but it was very similar where I would give them the topic and then ask them to do the writing. You could imagine doing the exact same thing with the free speaking activity where they're writing down how many words they said in the minute that they had to speak for each of the different topics in each of the different weeks. So now we move to the last step, the 4th step in the cycle, which actually feeds into the first step, because after you reflect and you evaluate, you can think about the next time around, how do you want to improve things? How do you want to change your planning to take into account some of the different things that you observed? So here with the free speaking, some of the reflection and evaluation questions you could ask are, do the words that the students spoke increase over time? Do the errors that they're producing decrease over time? And then you could also ask questions about the structure of the student's speech. How could it be made more comprehensible? Is there a clear introduction? Is there a clear conclusion? And is there a clear body? Or would some instruction about how to organize their speech help to make it more effective as a communicative act? Colin?
Okay, it says my internet is unstable. So if I am not clear, please let me know, Theron.
I can hear you just fine.
Good. So in talk, walk, and write, you got different data here. You've got the numbers, and as Theron showed you on the previous slide, you've got numbers that go up and they go down. I've called these dips and spikes. What do these numbers tell you? That's something that you can think about. Remember, this is for you. You don't have to publish this in a journal. You can just use this data to now inform the future. For example, maybe the reason why the numbers went down was because the topic was too difficult. The students had to spend more time thinking about what they were saying or what they were reading or what they were writing. So that's important to know. Look at the numbers. But don't just look at the numbers. Also look at, well, your own observations. For example, maybe there was a dip, the production went down, the number of errors went up. Maybe because, well, that day there was a sports day the day before, or the students were, for the first time, it was mixed, or something else was happening in the environment. So don't just look at the numbers. Also look at notes that you make to yourself. This can help you inform your own teaching. Lastly, as a teacher, you've got to decide, are you going to make these records public or are you going to keep them private? Is each group going to come to the teacher and report their number? Or are you going to make a big class board and write down everybody's score, each group's score? There are positives and negatives for both. My recommendation, you know your context, you know your students. Age, whether it's co-ed, there are tons of factors that affect what you will do. One idea, do this with a buddy. Try to find another teacher. That will help you to make better decisions. And sometimes when I can't understand how to do something, by trying to explain it to Theron, I understand it better myself. So working with another is a very important point. Theron?
Yeah, I think one thing that I want to say there with the public versus private is I think Colin's referring to that in the context of the classroom. So do you as the teacher want to know the numbers, or do you want to make it visible to the other students? I think totally another 90-minute presentation could be done about research ethics and whether to make those numbers public by, for example, giving a presentation about them. So here we're talking specifically about in the classroom, whether you want, how you want to share the data with the students and whether you want to share the data with the students. Usually for my students in my context, if I'm investigating something such as this free speaking activity, each week I'll try to show the data so that the students know how their performance is changing on a week-to-week basis. I find that makes them more interested in the activity, more interested in what's going on in the classroom, and that engagement means that they continue to maintain their motivation and their interest over time. So we're coming back to the learning cycle. I think, Colin, can I pass this to you?
Yeah. So what we tried to do here is to provide a sort of like a scaffold, an idea of how you can look at just one activity. Please note the two activities that Theron and I talked about, that would just be one in several. So we're just focusing on very small scale. and we're just focusing on planning. What do we need to do before the activity to help us better understand the task? During, what do we need to do while we're in the classroom, while the activity is happening? Observation, how are we going to objectively look at what we did? Either notes that we made to ourselves or numbers, some way of generating data that informs our ideas about the production or the output that the students are doing when it comes to the activity. And lastly, we need to set aside some chance for reflection or evaluation of the activity. Here again, it's good to have a buddy, have another teacher who can help you understand what you are seeing. And maybe with their help, become a better teacher as well. Now, we're going to next talk about an example. Darren?
Yeah, so I think one more thing that I want to add is when Colin says lastly reflect and evaluate, what he means is in this one cycle, that's the last step. And then naturally, you'll start to think about the next time you're going to be in the classroom or the next group of students you'll see. And so that reflection and evaluation isn't necessarily the end. You can use those reflections and evaluations when you do your next planning and preparing. So then that's why it's not Kolb's learning steps 1, 2, 3, 4. It's Kolb's learning cycle, because the idea is you go around multiple times so that what you reflected on then informs your future practice. And then
Darren?
You do it again and it informs your future practice again.
There are some hands raised. Do we want to take questions now, or do we try to do it at the end?
No,
Let's
Colin,
finish our
we'll take it towards
presentation.
the end.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the other thing, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The other thing that Colin mentioned was that this is just one activity in your classroom. So I definitely do not do free speaking with all the students over the course of a 90-minute class, and that's the only thing that I do. So the idea is to think about one activity that you might try to do the cycle with, and then of course you'll have the other parts of the class where you're not focusing as intensely on the observation and the reflection, because as Colin said, as teachers, we're all very busy. And so it's important to ration how much time we spend doing these kinds of investigative projects, because we can spend a lot more time investigating, and then the time that we have to actually do our lessons or prepare our lessons ends up suffering. So because we're giving this presentation for ELT Pune chapter, I said to Colin while we were preparing, we've given 2 examples from our experience in our contexts, but I felt uncomfortable just talking about teaching in Japan. And so I wanted to give an example from the Indian context. This example is from one of the 2 books that I was lead editor on, Innovating EFL Teaching in Asia. And the book chapter is by Anderson and I'm going to get the name wrong, I'm sure, Narayanan. And it was an investigation they did in Tamil Nadu. Now, we're trying to talk in this presentation about small scale projects. This was a book chapter published in a book that was published by Palgrave Macmillan. And so while it is small scale to a certain extent, it's probably much larger scale than most of the teachers here are thinking about doing. So I'm going to try to summarize the larger project, and then I'm going to try to explain how you could think about that larger project on a much smaller scale, on just a classroom scale. So this is the larger project. There were program schools where they did some extra education with the students. And then there were control schools that didn't have access to the extra education that the students were getting. And they looked at the students' learning of several different items: the basic vocabulary, advanced vocabulary, simple instructions, and questions and responses. I'm just going to look at the basic vocabulary, so the other data you don't need to worry about. You'll see that at the program schools, the students started being able to understand the basic vocabulary about a little more than half the time. And by the end, they could get the basic vocabulary about 84% of the time, with a 28% change. And then at the control schools, they started off being able to understand the basic vocabulary about a third of the time. By the end, they could understand it about 50% of the time, and there's an 18% change there. Now, we've been trying to say to you to think about a small scale. So thinking at the school level, for our presentation today at least, is too large of a scale in our opinion. So one way to reconceive or to think about this again would be to have two classes. So you could have one group of students in class A, where you do some new activity or some new way of learning vocabulary. And then you have another group of students in class B, where you teach them the way that you've usually taught them in the past. Or maybe you have two different teachers, one teacher who teaches the way they've always taught, and another teacher who tries something new. And instead of looking at 4 different things, which is what the authors of this book chapter did, you can just look at the students learning the basic vocabulary. And this is an example of what they did for the basic vocabulary in the book chapter. So they went through the textbook that the students were learning, and they pulled out the key vocabulary that the students were expected to know, and they'd write down the vocabulary in English, and they'd write down the vocabulary in the student's first language, and then they would take a photo to create a vocabulary card so that they could look at the vocabulary card and see what the vocabulary was based on the photo. And then they used these cards for the students to drill the vocabulary. Now, thinking about your own context, thinking about how busy you are, you don't necessarily need to make all of these materials yourself. One of the things you could do is you could have your students get involved by having them participate in producing the vocabulary cards, so that it isn't just you as the teacher having to do everything, but instead, as part of the cycle, you can include the students, for example, using their cell phones to take pictures of one another to illustrate the vocabulary, or your students writing down the vocabulary on cards in order to make these cards that they can then use later on as part of the learning activity. That's basically what the authors of this chapter did. This is, from what I understand, a picture of one of their students modeling this vocabulary. And they said that the students being part of the cards actually made them much more interested in learning the vocabulary, because it was them, it was their picture. It wasn't just some abstract picture from the internet. So they had more ownership of the activity. Did I miss anything here, Colin?
No, I think you got it just perfectly.
All right, wonderful. So then I'll pass it back to you to talk about the learning cycle one more time.
All right. So what we're proposing today is that one idea, if you have an idea of what you want to change, and a lot of you do, is to try to think of how you can do these 4 steps every time you do the activity. To think about what you need to do beforehand. Think about what you're going to do during the class. You, the teacher, not just the student. Think about how you're going to observe what it is that the students are doing. Observe the effects of the activity. And then think about reflection and evaluating. How are you going to use this data to make changes. This cycle is, I think, very useful. I use this, for example, when I do presentation courses. So though the activities that we've talked about today are maybe more appropriate for maybe high school or junior high school or first year university, you can actually use this in graduate level classes. You can use this structure, Kolb's learning cycle, as a scaffold to better understand what you are doing. Is there anything else that you wanted to say, Theron?
Yeah, I think I wanted to link this specifically to the book chapter that I mentioned. So in this case, the planning and the preparing was the selecting the vocabulary. The doing and the experiencing was both creating the vocabulary cards and then also having the students practice with those vocabulary cards. The observing was watching the students create the vocabulary, helping them to do that. And then it was also looking at how well they learned the vocabulary over time. And then the reflecting and evaluating, they could, through that chart that I showed you, show that the students who got this intervention, who had those vocabulary cards, actually learned more than the students who didn't have access to them. So they could show that this was a successful intervention. And I think it's always nice to see these successful interventions. And if you're trying to present or you're trying to publish, almost always the expectation is that you will publish successful interventions. So if you read the literature, you'll find lots of examples of this worked, this worked, this worked. But you can also learn a lot from when students don't necessarily improve. So for example, with that writing task that I did, I was using that free writing task at a high school in Nagano, where I worked before, and it was quite successful. But that when I came here to the University of Toyama, I tried it with my students here, and I found that their writing speed didn't increase, basically because they had already reached a kind of plateau of writing speed. And so that taught me that instead of working on their writing speed, I could work on improving the students' writing quality. So don't always feel like if you don't find some successful conclusion, it's a failure. That can actually inform your practice just as much as finding success through these investigations. Anything you want to add, Colin?
No.
All right. So thank you very much. And then I think I will turn it over to Pranuma as the anchor for the question and answers.
Right. I mean, that was indeed a wonderful session. Thank you, Theron and Colin, for that amazing, amazing presentation. It was indeed very informative. Thank you once again to both the speakers. It is now time for a very important thing. We will now have a small photograph. I would like to request everyone in the panel to switch on their cameras so that we can capture this moment. Yes, can I request Neha, Sarita, and Hemlata too, as they are a part of the panel? Kiran, could you please turn on your video?
I think he's left the building.
No, he's here.
He's there, he's there. He's very much there.
Hi.
Yeah.
All
Yes, Rahul, are we done? Yes.
I noticed in the chat and in the Q&A, there were some rather interesting things that people were talking about.
Right. We'll move to it very soon. So thank you once again. I would now request Dr. Atul Patil, the Vice President of ELT Pune chapter, to summarize the takeaways and forward the participants' questions to our guest speakers. Over to you, Atul.
Yes, thank you, Pranuma, very much. I'd like to thank both the speakers, Theron and Colin, for their stimulating presentation. Please accept our sincere appreciation for your outstanding and interactive session today. Your opening of the presentation with the beautiful pictures made us feel as if we were in Japan. The two very pertinent questions that you asked at the beginning of the presentation could really set the tone of the webinar and encouraged all the participants to get involved with their comments and questions. It was very interesting to hear about your experiences, and the slides you showed gave us a close look at classroom investigation that we can carry out. Your responses and remarks on the messages in the chat box were very timely, and your explanation of the Kolb's learning cycle was very effective. The activities of free speaking and talk, walk, and write were very impressive. The PDOR approach of planning, preparing, doing, experiencing, observing, and reflecting or evaluating was very well explained. And the example from India could really provide an example to support the approach and teach vocabulary in a better way. In a nutshell, it was a very wonderful presentation with very practical takeaways for all the participants. Well, before we go ahead with our question and answer session, I would once again, on behalf of the office bearers and the members of the Pune chapter, as well as the president of Pune chapter, Professor Z.N. Patil, would like to thank both the speakers for their time and for the insightful presentation. May I know if Professor Patil, the president of Pune chapter, would like to say a few words before we move on to the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you very much, Atul. And thanks a lot, Theran, and thanks a lot, Colin, for a very scintillating, very enriching and enlightening presentation. We can't thank you enough, Theran and Colin, for this wonderful opportunity. Now, I'd like to share just one activity that I administered several years ago in a high school class. You know, I was supposed to meet 3 different groups on 3 different days of the week, right? I was supposed to meet class A on one day and class B on another day and class C on a third day. And I told them a story, and the story was the same. The groups were different, the classes were different, but the story that I told them was the same, and the activity that I administered was the same. For example, I narrated the story in the 3 different classes, and I chose some important or key words from the story. I first familiarized the students with the characters in the story and the plot of the story, and so on and so forth. So they had a sort of complete knowledge of the story as far as the content was concerned. And they were also familiar with some key words that were used in the story. Now, I gave 4 words chosen from the story. The words were heard, H-E-A-R-D, heard, cottage, gold, and blanket. And I requested my class to compose a poem, a sort of a poem. And this is what they came up with. People, one and all, had heard, people, comma, one and all, comma, had heard of a humble and white shepherd. Heard, shepherd. I had given them the word heard, and they gave me the word shepherd, and they could, the 2 words rhymed together. People, one and all, had heard of a humble and wise shepherd. He lived in a humble cottage, but was known for his courage. He didn't have silver or gold, but truth he always told. He just had an old blanket. And here was the problem, because most of those boys and girls in that particular class thought that the word B-U-F-F-E-T was pronounced as buffet or buffet. Actually, the word is buffet or buffet. The letter T is silent, but they were not aware of this phenomenon called silent letter, and therefore they came up with this kind of line, you know. He just had an old blanket. This was the word that was given by me, blanket. And they composed the line, but was more delicious than buffet, right? They chose the word buffet because they thought that the T letter was not silent. And they thought that the word buffet rhymed with the word blanket. So you very rightly spoke about designing. First, we design an activity. We prepare an activity, construct an activity, and then we administer that activity in a class. And then we observe how that activity is perceived by the learners and how those learners respond to that kind of activity. And there are several responses coming from different corners of the classroom. So we first design an activity, then we administer the activity, and then we observe how the activity is being perceived and how the activity is being responded to. And then we critique our own designed activity. We examine the strengths and the weaknesses of the activity in the light of the responses provided to us, to the teachers, by the learners in the classroom. So we design an activity, we administer it, and we observe how it is perceived. We observe how the students or the learners respond to the activities, and we examine the strengths and weaknesses of the activity. And in the light of that kind of SWOT analysis, we try to improve the activity. So I was greatly impressed by the four-point division of an activity: designing, administering, observing, examining, and improving. These stages are very important. So I went to the other class and I gave them another set of words like word, wisdom, eager, and wise. And that group also, the story was the same. The story I had narrated to class A and B and C was the same. But in class A, I chose 4 different words and they came up with this kind of composition. Then I went to the other class and I gave them another set of words: word, wisdom, eager, and wise. And this is what they come up with. Once a king heard a word that in his land there was a shepherd who was known for his wisdom in all places throughout the kingdom. To help everyone, he was eager and would share his meal meager. The king spotted this shepherd wise and made him governor for his clever advice. Now here, the stumbling block was the word eager. You know, there are differences of spelling between American variety and British variety. And for historical reasons, we in our country follow the British spelling. This doesn't mean we are allergic to American variety. No, we are not. We prefer American variety for many reasons. For example, it's very revealing and it's very brief. For example, we don't use double L in woolen, we use single L in American variety, or traveler, we use single L. So we prefer both the varieties. But since we were a colony of the British, in our country, we followed the British spelling. So eager, E-A-G-E-R. Now, here, the student didn't make a mistake. The student unknowingly used the American spelling because he thought E-A-G-E-R. So the sequence was E and R, not R and E. And therefore, he wrote the spelling of meager as M-E-A-G-E-R, which was not wrong, right? Colin and Theron, I suppose this is the American spelling? M-E-A-G-E-R, meager?
Well, this is where I get a little confused because as a Canadian, we use both.
Uh-huh.
And so
yeah.
I think I would be, I'm probably not the right person to ask.
Yeah, even in India, we sometimes use British and sometimes use American spelling and grammar and so on and so forth. So this is just an example, additional example, in addition to so many examples that you cited during your presentation. So this is an example of how we design an activity and we administer it and we observe how the activity is perceived and understood and responded to, and how we examine the strengths and weaknesses of the activity and then improvise or improve the activity. Thank you very much, Karen and Colin, for a wonderful, unforgettable, memorable presentation that you made today. And I'm sure all the participants from India and abroad are going back home very rich people. They're going back home very rich. They're carrying lots of takeaways to their classrooms, and I'm sure we will remember your presentation for years to come. Thank you so much, Teran and Colin. And back to you, Atul.
Thank you, Professor Patil. Your comments are always like the icing on the cake. Thank you. So now we move on to the question and answer session. We have 5 to 6 questions in the Q&A box. Initially, one of the participants requested you to throw some light on blended learning. So either of you, if you could speak on blended learning briefly.
So I think by blended learning, I assume the participants referring to trying to mix online learning and also face-to-face learning. So some of the things that I did this last semester during the emergency online teaching, where I didn't see any of my students, were I wanted them to do that kind of speaking activity where they were sharing their experience, but nobody was in the classroom. So instead of being able to do that sharing in the classroom, I would ask them to record themselves and then to upload their recording to the university's learning site. Our university uses Moodle. Other people's schools may use a different software. But anyway, to upload their recording so then other students could listen, and then other students could record questions for that student and upload those questions as well. So if you're working with students who are actually in the classroom, you could have them do the activity in the classroom, and then you could also give them an opportunity to share what they did on some learning platform. I have 6 classes that are basically the same. And so one of the things I try to do is, because I do the same activities in all 6 classes, even though they're different groups of students, I try to create a space where if they make something, they can share it with students from the other 5 classes who they don't necessarily know, as a kind of experience to not just share with the students in the classroom who they see every week, but to share with the larger student population in the university. If you want to add something, Colin, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I mean, this topic could be the topic of a whole seminar. We could get into blended learning, we could get into flipped classrooms, hybrid classrooms. So, and then context on top of that. Context plays havoc with this question, because if you've got young learners, how you approach a blended classroom will be very different than, for example, postgraduates. So I'm very hesitant to give any kind of answer to this question. That said, project learning is very useful in this time of COVID. Giving your students some sort of project that they can individually do by themselves, and then come back and share their answers, what they learn, and try to come together and make some sort of presentation or report, or have them actually make something. There's also why only have in your classroom. The other cool thing about being online is that you can do this with people from other countries. I once saw a presentation where the students in South Korea had the instructions, and the engineers in Saudi Arabia had to build something. So for those of us that are in, for example, in engineering, I'm looking at the Maritime College there, you've got, you could sort of outsource the different roles that students have to play. Before class, try to find out the vocabulary. Think about what words are needed in order to understand the instructions. The ideas are endless, but the first thing that you have to think about context. What is appropriate for your learners? Technology, vocabulary level, it goes on and on. With that, I would say next question.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a very, vast topic, and we can have another seminar or a webinar on this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for answering this question. The second question is about the use of mother tongue. And the question goes like this: how to get rid of mother tongue in the process of teaching and speaking English?
I have I've done research on the topic of translanguaging, and so kind of the evolution of language teaching goes, people are going to, for example, the US, and they're expected to give up their mother tongue language, and they're expected to only learn English and only use English, to more of a multilingual paradigm where the majority of people in the world speak more than one language. And so the idea is you have more than one language and you move between the languages. The latest argument is for translanguaging, which says that in our minds, we don't have like an English space and a Japanese space and a Hindi space. And in our mind, there isn't a small character running back and forth between these different languages. They're actually all mixed up. And so because of that, it's natural in the vast majority of the world for people to know more than one language, and when they're speaking, to use more than one language as if they were the same language. So when I'm talking to my wife or my son, I may use English and Japanese all together. And it isn't like, oh, I'm going to speak to you in English now, oh, I'm going to speak to you in Japanese now. It's just a conversation. And so my personal opinion is, in the language classroom, to say to students, this is an English only space, actually limits the resources they have available to them to make meaning. Now, that doesn't mean you can say, speak any language you want, do whatever you want. We're not teaching anything today. What that means is, in the context of learning English, it's okay for students to go back and forth. So if they're trying to say something and they don't know what to say in English, they may switch to another language and say, well, I know what it is in this language. And then the challenge becomes for their partner to help them express it in English. Now, it doesn't always happen that way. Like with my students, when they're talking to one another, they will, if they switch to Japanese, they may just stay in Japanese. So as a teacher, you want to create some system for them to track what they're doing. So like what I've done in the past is I've had them record, and then they may be switching between English and Japanese. And then after they're done, I may have them listen to the recording. And then I may say, okay, you need to explain this conversation to a Korean who doesn't know Japanese. So you have to figure out what you were saying in Japanese. You have to figure out what it was in English so that you can explain the conversation, or you have to translate the Japanese parts to English so that they're moving between languages. Because that's usually the way people interact on an everyday basis. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Colin.
Yeah, I like the idea of bringing the student, bringing the student into this and saying, okay, you're taking responsible for this. You're taking responsibility for it. Another way to implement that system is to do what's called a needs analysis. Now, anybody who, I would imagine Prabhu, who is, he was graduated from Oxford, but he's actually from India. And he is a father of task-based language learning and teaching. And Prabhu talks about how our students, when they come into the classroom, they're not switching over to English. They're still in wherever they just came from. And that idea of social cultural theory, that idea of there is something before the classroom. And so you need to kind of give students a chance to warm up. You need to have some sort of transition activity where students are making the transition into English. So that's one practical thing I would suggest, is to have some sort of easy turn on your English brain kind of activity. The second thing I would do is have the students be part of the rulemaking. There's a theory called activity theory. And activity theory is, it's basically the rules within a group, within any group. For example, in this group here, some people have the power to speak and some people do not. And just because of the medium, that's how we've set this up. One thing about activity theory is that most of the rules are unstated. And so we need to, with our students, we need to, when it comes to language, we need to make those rules stated, to make them explicit. One way to do that, right at the beginning of the semester, negotiate with your student. Negotiate and say, when can we use language? When can we use the L1? And when do we stick with English? So for example, during an activity, English only. Before an activity, you're allowed to ask questions in the L1, check comprehension. Making those kinds of rules explicit will help the teachers and the students to accomplish what they want to get done. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. The next question from Ankush Pawar. In fact, he has asked two questions, and in the interest of time, I'd like to combine both of them. He is asking how much practice is required for a teacher before the delivery of the lecture. And the second question from him is how to make the class interesting. So probably he's talking about the 4 P's of presentation that we always talk about: planning, preparation, practice, and then presentation. So he wants to, he wants you to throw some light on the importance of practice and how to make classes interesting. Over to you.
Darren.
All right. So I think one thing to keep in mind as far as the lectures go is the more interactivity you can put into the lecture, the more engaged the students will be. And also the more interactivity you can put into the lecture, the less you need to practice delivery of a full 90-minute lecture prior to the lecture, or however long your lessons happen to be. So instead of, for example, speaking to the students for a full 90 minutes, you could say there are 4 main, or however many main topics you want to cover, and you could spend a certain amount of time covering one of those main topics. Then you could ask the students to together produce some project that shows you they understood what those activities, what that point was. So in my classroom, I tend to have about 50 students. And if I ask all 50 students to write out what I told them, I get 50 pieces of paper. And I have 8 classes a week. And so 8 times 50 means I end up with 400 pieces of paper that I have to check. I don't have time in a week to do that. So what I tend to do on my lessons is I'll make, say, a group of 4 or a group of 5, which means instead of 50 pieces of paper, I'm getting, say, 10 pieces of paper. And then in those groups, I ask them to summarize what I've told them. So they have to check comprehension together, and they have to produce something that they give to me that then helps me to understand that helps me to see that they understood what I said to them. That brings in aspects of active learning, and that brings in other aspects that we could talk about. For example, with a flipped classroom, you might say, I have a lecture that's on the internet that I want you to watch, or there could be some other professor that's delivered a lecture that you want them to watch and understand. And then in the classroom, you can focus on checking comprehension as opposed to focusing on just the lecture delivery. I think I've covered that question as well as I can in the time we have. Colin, do you want to add anything?
What was your question again?
That was about the importance of practice and how classes can be made more interactive.
Okay, for me, a classroom becomes interesting if the students are engaged. So I'm going to address the second part first. So if your students are not engaged, that means you either they don't understand what they're doing, they don't understand why they're doing whatever task it is that they're being asked to do, or they're bored. So you need to. This is where small scale investigation is actually quite helpful, because what happens is students, you find out why are students bored at this point. For example, in a 90-minute class, at about the 45-minute mark, that's when students are at their lowest energy. So one idea, at the 45-minute mark, I have banana time. I have my students come out, they get out a banana and they eat a banana. Now, I teach, first and second year students. So they're not children. But giving them that 5-minute break where they're just talking to each other, they're relaxing, brings their energy right back up. And then we start the class again. That's one of the freedoms that I have as a coordinator. Not every teacher has that. But you do have other things at your disposal. You can space out what activities you do. If you're finding your students are bored, maybe cut up your activities. Or do more. Get them moving. I've never seen a student who's moving who's bored. So that's one of the things that I would recommend. If you're finding your students are not interested in your class, get them moving. As for practicing, there's all sorts of things that you can do. What I would not recommend is do what I'm doing right now, is just to keep speaking, because that makes your energy go down. Instead, try to turn it and get them speaking in some way, get them producing in some way, get them writing in some way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 3 more questions. The next question is, what methodology is to be followed to teach grammar in the large classroom?
Is it me, Colin?
I'll take this one first. There's a lovely teacher by the name of Scott Thornbury, and he talks about inductive and deductive instruction. And one way is to present the grammar rule, and then have the students remember it. Another way is to give students many different examples, preferably with words they already know. So they know the words, they just don't know the grammar. If you can have that kind of situation, you can then start to say, okay, well, what's happening here? What do you notice? And let them discover the rule. That's called an inductive way of teaching grammar. And in a large classroom, this is where, if you've got a microphone, get students talking to their partners. Say, by the next 10 minutes, I want you guys to figure out what the rule is. You got 10 minutes, here's some examples, go. And it's chaos. You got lots of noise. Students are talking, they're talking in different languages. But the cool thing is, I guarantee you, they're trying to figure out what the rules are. If they already know what the words of the meaning of the words are, then it's then becomes strictly a decoding kind of activity. And it's actually kind of interesting, because you're not telling them what the rules are. I guarantee you, if your students are engaged, they'll be working very hard, either in English or in their L1, to try to figure out that rule. And that's what you want. Even if they get it wrong, that's not important. What's important is they're thinking about what are the rules. And if you can do that kind of an approach, after a little while, they're trained to start thinking about grammar without you teaching it. That's what you want. That leads to learner autonomy. That leads to more self-directed learning. Students wanting to be able to read something that they can't. So they try to figure out the rules for themselves and they talk with a friend. Very, very good, very sound teaching in my book. Darren?
Yeah, I don't know what context you're teaching the grammar in, like who the students are. And when you say big classrooms, I have a book that was produced by the British Council where the author writes like, is a big classroom 50 students, 500 students, 5,000 students? Like there's different scales of big. My experience with grammar, specifically the teaching of grammar, is students are used to seeing it in isolation, particularly in Japan where I teach. Students learn grammar a sentence at a time, but almost never is grammar just at the sentence level. Like the whole purpose of grammar is for cohesion in the discourse, for having ideas come together at the paragraph and at the larger structure, at the paragraph, at the section, at the article level. So a lot of times when I work with students, what they don't understand is that, like in English, you put the most important information first. And so complicated grammar tends to be getting the important information at the beginning. That's what makes the grammar complicated. Like it isn't complicated grammar to make complicated grammar. It's complex grammar because there's a communicative message that needs to be told using that complex grammar. So I would suggest thinking about discourse, cohesion, and thinking about grammar beyond the sentence level.
Thank you very much. The second last question is about any specific techniques that you use for slow learners, and if so, which are they?
Do you want to take this, Colin? Do you want me to?
Slow learners, you see, this is where things get tricky because it's, yeah, like slow learners can be, it could be a proficiency level. So the slow learners are those who are less proficient, or it could be a cognitive thing where slow learners are not as cognitively developed. It could be the source of the slow learning needs to be better understood. And so how I would treat that in the classroom would depend on that. And if I had any control over whether or not to move or to group. Usually, like one idea is to group slow learners together. That's not necessarily a good idea. Sometimes if you can group more proficient learners and slow learners together, they actually help each other because more proficient learners have to reteach. And by reteaching that, they learn the activity. Here, this is actually a really good topic for a small scale investigation. Try different ways of grouping what works in your context. Again, age and proficiency level here are also going to be very important in how I would deal with this. Darren, your turn.
All right. I think Colin addressed one of the main issues, one of the main ways that I try to deal with learners who have trouble keeping up, which is I tend to make groups of about 4 learners in my class. Like I said before, that means that the group has to produce something that they give to me rather than each individual making something. So that reduces my work as the teacher. in terms of having to mark papers that students give me. It also means that the students can share information in those groups. So if you have a slower learner, their group members can help to explain things so they can understand it. Since we've already talked about technology to a certain extent, this is where like a flipped classroom could be very beneficial. If like for my free speaking, when I model the activity, I will, when I can, I will record it and then I will upload it so that the students can listen to it on their own devices again. Because students have asked me to repeat myself, and it gets kind of old telling the same story 2, 3, 4 times. But if I record it one time and then I upload it and I say, it's here, and I put the link on the board, and then they can visit it themselves and they can listen themselves, they can listen as many times as they want. Sal Khan from the Khan Academy, he said that was one of the big advantages of creating the Khan Academy, creating those videos, was you don't feel stupid if you pause a YouTube video and listen to it 10 different times. But if you're talking to somebody, you do feel bad, or you can feel like there's some problem with you if you have to ask them to repeat themselves again and again and again. But with YouTube, YouTube doesn't judge you if you watch the same video 10 times. In fact, YouTube is very happy if you watch the same video more than once. So I think I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you. The last question says, from your talk, I understand that your students are allowed to use mobile phones in the classroom. Could you please throw some light on classroom management?
I did a whole workshop on classroom management several years ago. I actually have the workshop I did is based off of Tools for Teaching by, I think it's Fred Jones. So, I mean, classroom management is its own topic in and of itself. And it's after my dinner time, so I don't want to talk until 9 o'clock tonight about classroom management. In terms of cell phone use in the classroom, what I tell the students is there are certain times when they can use their cell phones, and there are certain things that they are allowed to use their cell phones for. Cell phones are very powerful translation engines. So if they don't understand some content, they can use Google Translate to check what they're supposed to be doing, or to check vocabulary, or to check what they want to say. When they're talking to one another, I tend to ask them to put the cell phones away or to only use the cell phones for Translate. But I think the one thing I can say about classroom management is it's like being a parent. It's an active process. You have to be going around the classroom and managing. And as a teacher, if you see students who aren't on task, part of your responsibility as the teacher is to address that with the students and to work with them to get back on task. Not to assume they're not paying attention because they aren't interested, but to ask them, is there something you don't understand? Are you not sure what you're supposed to be doing? To give them the benefit of the doubt in order to try to bring them back into the class to actively participate again. I don't know if you want to add anything, Colin?
My take, I use mobile technology quite extensively in my classroom. That said, here in Japan, there's a researcher by the name of Glenn Stockwell, who's done some research on mobile technology use. And what he found was students actually resent us using mobile technology because it's their technology. And so it's sort of an invasion of their space. So you need to be very careful and kind of be judicious in how you use students' cell phones. For myself, because I like using cell phones when it's beneficial for learning. So what I have them do is I say, if you want to use your cell phone, put it face down on the desk. And then when you want to use it out in public. Put it up high and use it. So you're showing everybody that you're using your cell phone. The reason why I do this is that if a student is texting or if they are using it for a reason other than for language learning, they'll want to put their phone below their desk. And that's the easiest way to spot somebody who's using it in a way that I don't want them to use it. If they use it up like this, I know that they're using it. They can see, they know I can see them using it. And it's the most effective way I know to manage cell phone use. If you're going to use it in your classroom, again, it must be appropriate use. If you've got a classroom where you don't need the cell phone, have them turn off their cell phones as soon as they come in and keep it in their bag. Not every classroom needs a cell phone. In fact, I would say most don't. So be very, if you're going to use a cell phone, if you're going to have students use their cell phone in the classroom, my approach is have a very clear idea of what it's going to be used for. If you don't have an idea, get rid of it. They can always, if they need their dictionary or whatever, they can always go and get it. Or they can bring an electronic dictionary or a paper-based dictionary, or have one person who is the dictionary person and they keep their phone out. That's another idea. Assign a role for the cell phone. Have a clear idea of how to use the cell phone. That's how I use the cell phone in my classroom.
Thank you very much. We can't thank you enough for all your detailed and prompt responses with very relevant and pertinent examples as well. Thank you very much for answering all the questions by the participants. So over to you, Pranima.
Atul.
Yes, sir.
Can I have a minute?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Theran, are you listening?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, I'd like to get your books. I don't know whether they're available, Innovating in EFL. One is entitled Innovating in, what are the titles of the books? Are they available on Amazon?
Yes, they are. Just a second here.
Oh, maybe you can send the titles via WhatsApp later.
Yeah, I can send them to you. So one is Innovating EFL Teaching in Asia.
Wonderful.
And then the other one is Exploring EFL Fluency.
Yeah, and they are available on Amazon.
Yes, they are. They are available on Amazon.
Okay, and I have a similar book, only for information, your information. It's called, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Innovations in English language teaching. Innovations in English language teaching. Voices from the Indian Classroom. It was published by Orient Black Swan.
Okay.
So it would be a good idea for us to exchange our views and maybe I can use your books and cite them in my articles or books, and you can do the same. Maybe when we meet, maybe when we meet in Japan next time or somewhere else for our international conference, English Scholars Beyond Borders conference, I can carry a couple of copies and give them to you, and request you to get me a couple of copies of your books.
Sure, we can talk about that later.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was indeed a very interesting interaction. In fact, taking this conversation ahead, I would again request Professor Zenon Patil to give his concluding remarks for the whole session. Over to you, Zenon Patil.
No, actually, I've done my job. Anyway, we, the members, office bearers of ELT Pune chapter of English Language Teachers Association of India, all the members of this chapter, the office bearers of this chapter, and the attendees or the participants profusely thank Theran and Colin for a wonderful session, an unforgettable, memorable session. And I'm sure all of us are going to implement the ideas that were discussed by both the presenters. Thank you once again, Theron, and thanks a lot, Colin, for your inputs. And
All right.
we'll
Thank you very
send
much
you
for the invitation.
yeah, we'll send you a certificate of appreciation later through email.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And
Yeah,
thank you very much
so
for the
I would
invitation.
actually
Pleasure.
now, I would actually now like to officially propose the vote of thanks before we disconnect. So thank you very much for, first of all, for your valuable inputs, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, this session will be incomplete if I don't thank all of you. Therefore, on behalf of ELT Pune chapter, I extend my sincere gratitude to our guest speakers, Theron and Colin, for their very informative talk. I'm sure our viewers have learned many things from your talk. It was indeed a pleasure having you here. Thank you once again. I cannot thank enough our president of ELT Pune chapter, Dr. Zeran Patil, for making this opportunity available for all of us. It is because of him we always get to listen to such renowned experts. Thank you so much, sir. Thanks indeed. Special thanks to Captain
Thank you.
Krishnamurthy Iyer, Principal of the Lani Maritime Institute, for his kind support to accommodate these many participants in this webinar. Thank you for your valuable cooperation. We also extend our gratitude to all the participants and ELT Pune chapter members from India and abroad for their active participation. We are really lucky that we could reach out to all of you. I would also like to thank Atul, Kiran, Rahul, and all our office bearers for their kind support. Thank you, everyone. Those who joined us for the first time, we would like to request you to take a membership of ELT Pune chapter to never miss such opportunities in the future. See you for the next webinar. The details will be communicated to you soon. Thank you once again. Take care and stay safe.
Yep. And thank you.
Thank you, Theron. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you.